All right, we can be seated. Did any members of the jury have any problem with my admonitions not to talk to anybody about the case, not to watch anything about it, not to see anything on TV? Okay, thank you. With that, we're going to finish up with Dr. Ha this morning, hopefully. Dr. Ha, you were still under oath, and can you hear everybody? I can see your mouth moving. Are you muted?
Sorry, sir. I can hear you.
Perfect. Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Moran.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Professor.
Hello.
All right, you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Got home safe, good. And let me start here. After a smooth and quick process on Friday, you were qualified by the court in zoology, animal sensing systems, and the scientific principles underlying animal behavior. Are you still expert in those issues?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And that expertise, to reorient everyone, was gained over 40 years working with animals. Is that fair?
That is fair.
And also fair for everyone to be reoriented to the fact that you've taught students about those things at the expert, professional, collegiate, international, and community level. Is that fair?
That's correct.
And you've taught at 2 different universities as a professor related to those issues. Is that right?
That is correct.
And what universities were those?
Colorado State University and the University of Washington.
Good schools in my estimation. I suspect you'd agree.
I agree.
Okay. Permission to approach that big bag.
Okay. All right. Thought you might have a long way to go.
That's so tempting. Doctor, are you able to see my big black garbage bag?
No, I can't see anything to your right.
Okay. You do recall it from Friday?
Yes, I do. Now I see it.
Okay. And you remember the blue hat that we were talking about?
That's correct.
So I'll do this quickly. I know we talked about it. I suspect everybody was sort of tired after a long week, but just let me ask you this. In your opinion, as an expert in animal behavior, can anyone say with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that Dylan Redwine did not use the pillow from his dad's house based on the scent identification lineup at the fairgrounds?
It's my opinion.
Okay.
It's my opinion that we cannot conclude that.
Would the hat brought from mom's house, used to scent or prompt the dog, have smelled the same as the other items brought from mom's house that are in that bag?
It's my opinion that they would, yes.
And would the pillow from dad's house, even if it had been used by Dylan, have been perceived differently by the dogs than the items from mom's house?
It's my opinion that there's a very strong chance that that would be true, yes.
And does transporting the items from mom's house in the same car cause them to smell similarly but different than an item from dad's house?
Yes, it would.
Does it matter if the items in the large garbage bag were separated within the large garbage bag in their own plastic bags?
It would depend on exactly what the scents are, but it is very likely, since those plastic bags are very porous, that the smells would be mixed, intermingled, and the same.
I suppose as anyone who thought that they were going to beat scent detection dogs at the border with a bag full of drugs found out, plastic bags do not contain odors. Is that fair?
That is very fair.
And if you'll recall, I had you looking at People's Exhibit 186. It was some documents that the prosecution entered as an exhibit. It had a certification for trailing one. Do you recall these documents?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes, Judge. I allowed the last several questions, but all of this was done on Friday, so I think we should be moving on. These are all asked and answered.
I just wanted to reorient everyone. I'm trying to do it quickly. This is the last question to get everybody on
All
the same
right, but
page.
this needs to be the last question because
Understood. Would the trailing work done to earn the expired certification for trailing one have prepared a dog to do what was claimed to have been done at the fairgrounds?
It would not,
Why not?
because scent trailing is a very different cognitive process than the scent lineup work. And that is why there are separate protocols under best practices for training dogs and for executing those different procedures.
I wanted to double check this, switching gears here, but to double check this over the weekend. So it was nice to have a little time to look at stuff, but I have now reviewed the testimony that items from Colorado Springs were taken out of a hamper. Would that have caused mingling of odors?
Of course, yes.
Would items taken?
Okay, you've gone over that. You've talked about it. I think you've reoriented the jury. Can we get into some new stuff, please?
Your Honor,
Also, Judge-
on Friday, Your Honor was, I think, suggesting that things were not taken from a hamper. So now,
Right, and you just at the time, I know there was. Well, I'm not going to. The jury will remember what the evidence is. My memory of the evidence really doesn't make a whole lot of difference to you, and you should rely on your own memories. But I was corrected on that by you, and you were doing the examination, not me. So I want you to move on. You had something else, Mr. Johnson?
Just that the testimony was it was Dylan's hamper specifically.
Well, the
that
jury.
was
The
not
jury.
the testimony.
You know what? We're not going to argue about it. The jury's going to know what they heard and what they remember. And if you guys didn't bring it out well enough with the witnesses, that's a problem. But it's the way trials work. So please move on.
Dr. Ha, would it be possible to create an experiment to demonstrate the dog was capable of doing what was claimed here with respect to the scent identification lineup?
No, we're moving on off the scent identification lineup. That was my order just now. Please follow it. I mean, we did that Friday, and you said you were done with that topic.
Well, specifically what happened at the fairgrounds, this has not been covered. And if
You
I
said you were done with that?
I was done with the initial part of it and have reoriented the jury to where we were, this is new ground.
All right.
Doctor, would it be possible to create an experiment to demonstrate the dog was capable of doing what it was claimed to have done at the fairgrounds?
Yes.
And how would you do that?
Well, what you would do is you set up a careful double-blind lineup of known scent articles, and then carefully mix in articles that you know are blanks that are from a completely different location, and then repeat that, run the dog through that, see how the dog indicates how many false positives and true positives and so on that you get, and then repeat that several times.
In your expert opinion, having studied and taught zoology for more than 40 years, what would that experiment have shown with the dog at issue here?
If you're asking me what I would expect would have happened if we had done that experiment, I would expect that the dog would show that it was not accurate at scent lineup work.
Would the age of that animal in 2012 have had any impact on the dog's ability to accomplish this feat?
The ability to accomplish.
Hold on, there's an objection.
It's all speculative to ask what the dog would have done under a different scenario that they're setting up.
Perhaps you didn't object on that question, so it's in. Just a second. I think he can answer this question about the age of the, I think it was Sela in 2012. what impact that would have. So go ahead, Dr. Hawa.
All I can say is that from general scientific principles, the age as the dog ages, the ability to perform these scent tasks, whether scent lineup or trailing or any other scent task, declines rather sharply as the dog gets past its working age and gets into a senior or geriatric age.
In your expertise, what's that age?
For scent working dogs, it's generally somewhere around 7 years of age.
And are there any other factors that would have impacted that particular dogs to accomplish something for which it had not been trained or certified?
No, the main factors I think really on that are the lack of training. So that's the major issue, and then age will can contribute to further errors in that kind of tracking.
How about age of a sample, or if the items were several hours removed, does that have any impact in your estimation?
Oh, certainly. I mean, scent tracking dogs, trailing dogs are trained to work with scents that are, hours old, if not quicker. And so as soon as the materials begin to age at all, beyond a day, 24 hours, something like that, the efficiency of the dog and the ability to track that scent declines again dramatically.
So with what this dog was trained to do, tracking, and demonstrated an ability to do tracking within 4 hours, we're talking about something even well beyond what it had demonstrated some ability to do. Is that fair?
That's correct. That's correct, yes.
Professor, did you speak with the prosecution before trial?
Yes.
And is that common to do in your experience? It's good to reach out and share the information. Is that something you'd agree with?
I had an interview with prosecution sometime before the trial. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
And the information does not change based on who you're talking to. Is that right?
No.
So that's why it's no worries to speak with the prosecution.
Correct.
Judge, at this point, I'm going to object to leading. This is a direct examination, and every question is leading.
Just please stop leading.
Sure. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit here, Professor, to Karen Corcoran Gumming. I think you knew her better as Karen Corcoran, police officer from Wisconsin. So do dogs trained to give a final trained response? Let me back up. When her dog is her dog alerting to the scent of cadaver or something else?
When her dog is alerting, it is sensing the decomposition of mammalian tissue.
Does that include hair, fingernails, epithelial cells,
Yes.
blood?
Yes.
And do those things come from living humans?
They do.
So it's not a fair understanding to understand what that dog is sensing as a dead body.
Correct. I think it's very, very important to understand that when you're using a cadaver dog, they are sensing, they are tracking the products, the chemical products of decomposition. That does not necessarily imply death, as you point out. So you can have some spilled blood, a drop of blood, a hangnail with some blood, as you say, fingernail clippings. All these things, as soon as they leave the body, begin to decompose. And that is what a cadaver dog is, a well-trained, a qualified cadaver dog is very good at finding.
What if a cadaver dog, with respect to hair, is trained on only clumps of hair? Does that mean that a couple of hairs would be something the dog moves past, or what's your thought on that?
And this is where we take issue as scientists with this kind of tracking and using this kind of tracking as a definitive thing. We don't know out to get inside a dog's mind. And so it's going to vary, and it does vary a great deal when you train a dog, let's say, on large clumps of hair. How much hair is a large clump to that particular dog? And so you'll have some dogs which will detect 1 or 2 hairs on a given day. It may change because their mood changes with day to day. How they feel changes day to day. They are animals. They're not robots. They're not machines. Another dog might say, well, that's not a clump of hair. That's only 2 hairs. I'm going to ignore it. And so that's why this is very inconsistent as real evidence.
Do dogs get tired, hungry, or bored?
Of course. This is the kind of factors that can affect, just as they do affect humans. This is the kind of factors, and most people who own dogs, know that some days your dog is ready to go and wants to play, and other days they're having a down day. This, of course, is increases as the dog gets older, aches and pains, and a storm coming through, and it alters their behavior.
Is there any scientific or zoological behavioral understanding that allows you to say there's a such thing as only training a dog on large source scent? Does that make sense? And I can rephrase if not.
What you can do is you can only train on large source scent, and then the dogs are really intended. Then what you're saying then is that they are reliable at some level on large source scent. You can't then extrapolate to whether they're reliable, maybe giving false positives or false negatives on small source. So it's very specific to what the dog is trained on and what the dog is credentialed or tested on.
So if trained on large source scent, would they, in coming across small source of the scent they've been trained on, would they alert to that?
This is where you don't know. Yes, some might, and some might not. Some might on some days, some might not on other days. We don't know what they would do because you have not trained them on it. They have not. Would some of them confuse it? If the wind is blowing, then it's blowing it right in their face. They would maybe perceive it as being stronger than it really is. We don't know. It's not reliable information.
And could the age of something impact it? If it's been decomposing for longer, might it have a stronger scent?
Yes, I mean, it goes through periods. So as it begins to decompose, the scent gets stronger, and then the scent gradually gets smaller, less intense,
Okay.
more diffuse.
I see. So time impacts it, and something that's small is going to have more odor at some point during the period of time over which it's decomposing. And
That's correct. It sort of hits a peak of decomposition where all the different products, all the different biological products that are within that sample are all decomposing simultaneously, and then gradually those products are decomposed. That's the point, is to break them down and change them into something else, and the scent of decomposition becomes much, much less. Now, if you still have physical tangible biological material there, that very, very faint decomposition scent may go on for a very long period of time. And that's the stories we hear, where cadaver dogs are able to go out and find bones or tissue or something like that after incredible periods of time, because those items will continue to decompose for quite a long period of time.
so where the item is actually present, is that what you're saying?
That's when the item is actually present.
Switching gears here a little bit here, why not count what happens in the field when claiming a dog can reliably sense odor? Does that make sense?
Yeah, because that we don't know what the dog, for instance, we don't know what the dog missed. You didn't set up the system, and so you don't know what's there, and you don't know what's not there. And so there's no way we need to know when we are looking at the validity of a dog's ability, we need to be able to look at both false positives when their dog actually indicates and there's nothing there, and false negatives when there's something there and the dog misses it. And when you're in the field, of course, you know, when the dog indicates, you don't know whether there's something there or not, and when the dog doesn't indicate, you don't know if it missed something, I guess, which is a little strange, but there could have been something there that the dog should have indicated on, and it didn't. That's an error that affects, you know, the validity of that dog's tracking ability. So when you're in the field, it's too much of an unknown situation, and that's why we set up controlled tests. We often call them certifications or recertifications or something like that, but we need to keep continuously checking because, for instance, as the dog ages, their ability to use their scent ability declines and can decline very sharply at a certain age.
You were provided some materials that we received from the government in discovery. Do you recall reviewing something about Area 51, a garage at the
Yes.
sheriff's office?
Yes.
And there was a scent, well, is that a scent identification lineup that was created there? Even though
Yes.
all three items, each of the three items was suspected to have been of interest. Is that a creation of a proper scent lineup, or is that something else?
Well, I guess you could call it a scent lineup. I'm not sure it's a proper scent lineup, but
For the scent lineup, would you want to have items that are not of interest placed around as well?
that's right. Generally, with a scent lineup, there's a certain structure to it, and of course, you need to have trained the dog to perform scent lineups. There's issues with scent lineups that require very, very, very extremely fine discrimination on the part of the dog. So, as I have said earlier, that in many cases, many dogs can't do scent lineups accurately, and it needs to be set up correctly with blanks, control, and things like that.
How would a dog perceive items placed in an empty garage 6 feet apart? Would that impact its sensory system and draw its attention?
It may or may not. The problem with doing these kinds of, I guess if you want to call it lineups or tests or something, is that we don't know what the background smells are in the room. We don't know what the airflow is like in the room. It really doesn't tell us much, give us much information, because we don't know how the dog is perceiving that environment. We can't get inside the dog's mind to know what the dog is thinking. The only way the dog has to communicate that to us is by those indications, and there are so many factors that affect whether the dog gives its final trained response, that if you don't actually find something, the occurrence of just a final trained response is not information, is not useful.
And by find something, do you mean take it to a lab and corroborate it?
Correct. It's always been my position and the position of a scientist in this field that the work that scent dogs do, whether it's scent lineup or tracking or any kind of detection dog work, is amazing, and they are detectors beyond the ability of our own detection ability, and so they really are a tool to help us. But without being able to get inside the mind of the dog, if you use the dog to find tangible evidence, if a crime scene team comes in and finds blood or a bone or DNA or an article of clothing that you might not have ever found, you only found because of the dog's ability to scent, that's fantastic. That's why we use these dogs. But if the dog gives a final trained response and you don't find anything, there's too many reasons why they might give a final trained response, and we can't get inside their brain. We don't know what they're thinking. Why did you give a final trained response even though we can't physically find anything? that it's not valid information.
What possible influence? So these are, I don't know if you can see it on the table here. I know you can't see things to the right, but it's the green shirt and the blue shirt. I've also got the shoes and the jeans that were laid out. First, they were placed in bags 6 feet apart. Does the fact that those bags were in an evidence locker for 109 days become one of those things that could have impacted the dog, as you were describing?
That's exactly right. That's the kind of confound. In other words, we're not telling the dog, go find Dylan Redwine's scent. We can't do that. What we're telling the dog is to try to match to a particular scent, or to find a scent that's interesting because they have been trained to respond to decomposition. But we don't know what they're smelling. We know that there is something that they found interesting there, or it's a false positive. There may be nothing there, and the dog gave a false positive because of factors like cueing and other factors that lead them astray.
Does the fact that the dog alerted to 2 of the bags and not the third have any impact, or does that sort of bolster what you're saying?
That sort of confirms what I'm saying. Why do 2 and not the 1? It's the kind of conflicting information that we get from the dogs. So if you wanted to argue that, that hypothetically, because the dog indicated on the 1, then we should send it to the lab and see what they can find on it, that's fine. But just because they indicated on the 1, and especially since they didn't indicate on the other, on its own, without having found some corroborating physical, tangible evidence, there's too many other variables involved in this to have that provide any information.
Doctor, the blue shirt and the green shirt were held in a bag for 109 days together. If there was the scent of human remains on one of those shirts, would having put them in a bag together for that amount of time meant that scent, if it was present, got on both of those items?
Yeah, we would expect that the scent would be on both items. And therefore, we would suspect that the fact that the dog indicated on one and not on the others is an indication of an error on the part of the dog.
What does it say to you that when the blue shirt was taken off the ground and taken away, that the dog smelled the green shirt, did not alert, but went back to the location where the blue shirt had been and then gave a final trained response?
So, Judge, I'm objecting because this is beyond the scope of his expertise, and this is what we had talked about pre-trial.
No, I don't think that's where he's going. I think it's okay. You can answer.
So, what I think, for me, what this alludes to is the fact that this is a dog that is confused and not sure what it's smelling. And for instance, just to give you an example, we can't get inside the dog's mind. We don't know. For instance, it may be that it was rewarded for identifying the blue shirt. Now the blue shirt's gone, and it's going to get rewarded for going to where the blue shirt was. Right? It's saying, okay, how do I get rewarded? How do I do my job correctly and have praise for it? Then I go back to where that blue shirt was. That's a possibility based on scientific principles and how we know the dog's mind work. It may be that there really was a strong enough scent on that blue shirt, and then that scent was, of course, left on the floor very briefly, but on the floor when the blue shirt was removed. But we don't know.
If the scent was that strong, it stands to reason it would have gotten on.
You can't testify.
Oh, thanks.
Okay. I think your point is made, however.
Okay. Would that scent have gotten on the bag or the green shirt?
We would
If it
expect
got on the floor?
That's the confusing part about this evidence, and what leads me to conclude this doesn't tell me anything. This this is a very interesting exercise, but it doesn't really provide me any information because there's no way for me to really interpret the results.
Moving on to the shoes. If a final trained response occurs to the shoes, and then in the presence of the dog, people go to examine the shoes, how might that impact the dog? Can you say?
Effectively, the dog, by that behavior of the humans, the dog is rewarded, right? So the dog expressed interest in the shoes, gave its final trained response, and now the people go and look at the shoes. Oh, I did it right. See, now they're all interested in it, and I know that I did my job right. So the dog has now been rewarded for going to those shoes.
In your expert opinion, do the alerts to the clothing at Area 51 mean that that clothing had come in contact with a dead body?
No, I think that the results from Area 51 are inconclusive.
Switching gears again, there was an experiment conducted at the impound lot at the sheriff's office. So would a dog like Ms. Corcoran-Gummings be able to reliably find a car in an impound lot where someone had taken their life with a firearm?
I would expect so, yes.
If humans could smell the decomposition of that human who died by suicide and had left the windows down to air the car out, would that be something that a human remains detection dog would have an easy ability to recognize?
Yeah, if humans can smell it, the dog will have no problem with it.
So different scenario, part of this experiment that happened in the impound lot. There was someone who suffered a fatal drug overdose in a car and was removed from the car within hours after death. But her vomit was still in the car. Would that be a complex problem for a human remains detection dog?
No, that would be simple.
Would exposing a dog to those scents on the same day that you take that dog to a citizen's house pose any risk to reliable alerts later in that day?
If the dog is well trained, and I'm not questioning that Ms. Corcoran's dog was well trained, I don't think so. I mean, the problem is we don't know. Again, whether that scenting in those very, 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 very strong scents changes, I guess the best word to use is the mood of the dog or the temperament of the dog or the drive of the dog, and how it does that. We simply don't know. I mean, these are all fascinating questions we'd love to be able to answer, and we don't have the science to do that. So it would be unclear to me to what degree that would have an effect.
Moving on now from the impound lot to the yard of Mr. Redwine's home. And I think we get yelled at if you say Corcoran. It's Ms. Corcoran.
Oh, I'm sorry.
By order of the court. So there's testimony that
I have a relative myself who says Corcoran, so that's a tough one for me. I will try.
All right. But at Mr. Redwine's yard, it's an 80-degree day in August, and the human remains detection dog went and sat in the stream that runs in front of Mr. Redwine's house. What does that suggest to someone with your expertise?
That suggests that the dog was overheated and was attempting to cool off. Dogs can only cool off by panting and through their paws. They don't sweat from their skin, for instance, like humans do. And so the most effective way to cool off a dog is to have running water over their paws. And so dogs frequently go in streams to cool off.
Before I talk to you any further about the things at Mr. Redwine's house, I think we need to cover the concept of residual odor. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
And what is it?
Residual odor is the concept that if a body is placed in a certain location for a given amount of time, even very briefly, and then removed, leaving behind no physical, actual, tangible materials, skin cells or fluids or anything like that, nothing detectable, that odor remains. And that odor, it can be detected by human remains detection dogs. That's the concept anyway.
Is there scientific support for the existence of a residual odor after the compounds that make up volatile organic compounds are gone?
No, there is one study that was done, and it unfortunately has a number of different problems associated with it. There is one study that was done, I think it was in Belgium, that provided sort of the impetus to this concept, but it's a number of scientists have attempted to replicate it, never been able to replicate the effect. So it's at this time not considered a valid scientific concept, I guess, if you want to call it that.
Dr. Hall, are you talking about the carpet study?
That's correct.
And why is that study controversial?
The study is controversial because of the methodology that they used. For one thing, they only used one breed of dog, Malinois, which are not the most common breed of dog used for a lot of this cadaver dog tracking. They only used 3 dogs, so it was a very, very small sample size of a very specific population of dogs. In other words, these are Belgian Malinois, specifically from Belgium, and quite unlike even Malinois in the United States, for instance. The process that was used to obtain the samples did not prevent possible physical contamination. Now, when we're talking about residual odor, we're talking about a situation in which there is no tangible, measurable material in place. When we're talking about cadaver dogs are very, very good at detecting the odor of decomposition from existing material. We said that with cadaver dogs, you'll find something. There'll be blood, there'll be DNA, there'll be vomit, there'll be bones, there'll be something there that's continuing to produce the odor. In residual odor, there is nothing there. It is only the odor on the surface and in the air that remains. Nothing detectable by, say, a brilliant forensics team from the FBI or machines or anything else. And so there's the possibility that that there was actual contamination of the carpet samples, so that there was something producing decomposition following. There's difficulties in the study with the limited number of controls and blanks that they used. So it was really considered only to be a pilot study. That is, let's try this in a very small sample size in a very casual way and just see if we get anything from these dogs in this situation. They felt that they found something, that they saw the ability of the dogs to detect these residual odors. Others jumped on it and said, okay, with this information, let's try to do this in a much bigger way. And that's not been successfully done to date. And so there really is very, very, very little scientific evidence that residual odors actually exist beyond, in the estimation of chemists, about 24 to 48 hours. Now, within 24, maybe 48 hours, we think the dogs may be able to detect a residual odor in a location, in a home or whatever, from a body, from a dead body that was placed in a location and then removed relatively quickly.
So outside 24 to 48 hours, if there's a sense being emitted, then there's something present.
That's correct. That's my understanding of the scientific literature and the current state of the art. There are efforts going on to try to do some more definitive studies to try to establish the degree to which residual odor is a real phenomenon and for how long and so on. But that information is not available to us yet.
And that was something that reviewers of that carpet square study were able to determine, was that something was present on the carpet?
That's been of course speculated based on the procedures that they used, and has been admitted to by the researchers.
And also, suffice to say, it has not been replicated, replication being something important in science?
Yes, absolutely. You can publish something once, but if it can't be replicated by another lab, it's not considered science. Replication is a critical part of science, and none of us as scientists and scientific skeptics, if you want to say, believe a result, are convinced by a result unless it can be replicated. And there have been efforts to replicate this work, and they have not been successful. All of those studies all have deficiencies of one kind or another. None of them were considered definitive. So it leaves it to be a very open question, but the majority of scientists involved in this kind of work do not believe that residual odor could even exist. I mean, there are some reasons why it doesn't make sense. The rate of decomposition of these things, dispersal by wind and breeze and air movement, things like that would really make it very hard for a scientist who's familiar with these things to believe that residual odor could exist. But hey, we've been wrong before. We need to do the replicated definitive studies to show it. Those have not been done, and until those have not been done, we are very skeptical as to whether residual odor exists outside of the 24 to maybe 48-hour window.
So, from a scientific standpoint, what a dog is sensing is the volatile organic compounds. Is that right?
That is correct. Those are the compounds that are given off by decomposing mammalian tissue, including humans, squirrels, dogs, mice, rats, everything else.
And there are some things that are known about that. And when we're saying odor, what we're really talking about is these volatile organic compounds. And there's some things we do know. Does that include whether they're perishable and whether they degrade?
Yes, and that's what I'm talking about, that produces skeptics such as myself about residual odor. And because we know that these volatile organic compounds, we can measure them. We can take in scientific devices, we can capture those compounds, and we can measure them. And so when we do so, there have been many studies that have looked at volatile organic compounds produced by decomposition, quantified them, identified all the different compounds. There are hundreds of them. But we know that they're, volatile, hence the name, and that they break down very, very quickly. And we have an idea about how quickly they break down. And in general, most of them break down into their component parts in about 24 to 48 hours.
So, pardon me if this is obtuse, but hypothetically, what concentration of volatile organic compounds or odor would you expect to be available from a person deceased less than 24 hours, for less than 24 hours, weeks afterwards, weeks, months? And what we're talking about in this case is 109 days. Would that concentration be available if nothing were present?
Hold on a second, please. Objection?
Objection, Your Honor. There hasn't been a foundation that he has expertise to answer this question, and he hasn't identified any literature or peer-reviewed anything that would suggest that he has an answer to this question. So without that type of foundation, I object.
I'm going to sustain on the foundational.
Would there be sufficient concentration at the lengths of time involved in this case for an animal to sense those volatile organic compounds?
Same objection.
Yeah, it's a different. I mean, he's been testifying about this already. So I'm going to let him do it. I think it is close to the line or maybe slightly over it, but I think it's appropriate to answer the question. So can you answer that, Dr. Ha, please?
I don't believe that there would be any compounds remaining to be able to be detected by a dog after 24 to 48 hours, and certainly not after 109 days.
Would the dog's ability to sense something like that be enhanced if, say, a cadaver had been in a location longer? The fact that it was removed within 24 hours under a particular hypothesis suggests to me that the concentration would be lower. Do I make sense?
That's correct. The concentration of residual odor might be dependent. We don't know. But might be dependent. It makes sense that it would be dependent on how long the body, the organic material, was present. Remember that what we're usually finding is that if a decomposing body is in a location for a long period of time, it tends to have decomposed into the soil, into the ground, into the wood, and therefore there is remaining material. That's not residual odor. That means there's remaining fluids, fats, blood that's there and decomposing and may be continuing to decompose for years and detectable by a cadaver dog. So if we're saying whether something was there for 24 hours or whether something was there for 24 days and nothing remained, there was a hard surface and nothing was absorbed during decomposition, yes, the longer it was there might be more in the air, the residual odor.
In that situation, is it your opinion that you'd be able to find something? You can corroborate the alert.
In the situation I'm talking about, if a body was, material was in a location for a longer period of time, you would have decomposition, and that would be able to be detected. Yes, that's what we consider, for instance, what we call grave soil. There would be, a forensic lab would be chemically detecting that there had been decomposition going on there. You may only find it because of the dog's nose, but once found, there would be material there to sample and take back to the lab and identify and characterize.
Doctor, are there SWIG dog best practices for residual odor?
They're not. It's not defined and it's not considered a detection dog ability.
What is SWIG dog?
SWIG dog is a special working group on dogs as orthogonal detectors. It's a part of an effort by the Department of Justice originally to establish best practices for the use of dogs in detection in the justice system. That is defining the training, the choice, the training, the care, the kenneling, the nutrition, and the training certification use of any kind of detector dog. And they have different sections for the appropriate training for different tasks: bomb detection, drug detection, tracking, cadaver dogs, and so on.
In creating best practices, then, are they making recommendations for what should underlie a certification?
That's correct. The issue has come up that the certification, the training, and the certification, the validity testing of these dogs varies widely across the country, and therefore a courtroom can't know how to use that information because there were no standardized tests for whether a dog is a qualified, let's say, human remains detection dog. And the idea was to provide the best practices guidelines that should dictate the development of certification programs that allow us to know what you got when you're looking at the evidence from a detection dog.
Are there certifications for residual odor?
There are no certifications for residual odor. Again, it doesn't exist as a formal detection dog field.
How reliable would you consider a dog trained on high concentrations of odor to detect a residual odor? So large source sense detecting residual.
Objections beyond the scope of his
Hold,
expertise.
hold on, please.
And it's been established that he hasn't done any of these types of trainings or any of that himself. So for him to opine on the training technique and the reliability of it is beyond the scope of his expertise.
Animal sensing expertise would allow him an understanding of what level of concentration a smell would need to be in for a dog to sense it.
Well, he doesn't believe there's residual odor anyway, so why are you even asking the question? I mean, it's an obvious answer. So I'm going to sustain it on that basis. It's a waste of time. Go ahead.
Professor, are you familiar with a study that was done by Dr. Lisa Litt with respect to handler expectations affecting scent dog outcomes?
Yes.
What did that study tell us about dog sensing?
What that told us about dog sensing is that these trained final responses can be highly influenced by the handler's beliefs. That is, if a handler believes that there is something there, it will be transmitted to the dog, can be transmitted to the dog, and can affect the dog's production of trained final responses.
Your Honor, at this point, I've got an image that I'd like the professor to look at. It's Defense Exhibit 1222 and 1223. 1222 has been admitted. I spoke with counsel about 1223. It's two admitted exhibits that are side by side. And last I spoke with him, there was no objection to that exhibit. I'd asked to publish it. Dr. Haw has his own copy in front of him.
That's correct, Judge. I have no objection. This is for the record, 1223 is a compilation of two of the people's exhibits.
All right. So 1222 is already in. 1223 will be admitted. And are we going to have a copy of it? Yes. Thank you.
Professor, the one I want to start with, I'm not sure that yours had numbers on them, but there's one that on the left corner of the diagram of the living room, it says People's Exhibit 470. May I orient your attention to that one, please?
I don't have a 470 on mine.
Do you have one that shows a diagram with blue highlights?
Yes, I do.
And on that particular rectangle at the bottom left, does it say in red 470?
Not in the copy that I printed in front of me.
Okay. So on the left side of it, it says August 14th, 2013, looks to be a diagram of a home?
Yes.
Yep, that's the one. Cool. So with respect to this exhibit, there was an alert in the northeast corner of the living room.
Yes.
And at the northeast corner of the living room, as depicted in this exhibit, there is a coffee table, and it's lettered D. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And in the image on the right of that, there are arrows pointing to items of furniture in the living room. You see that?
Yes. Yes, I do.
And so what that is indicating is that on the coffee table, there was something that the Colorado Bureau of Investigation identified as blood. Are you able to see that?
Yes, I see that.
What does the indication in the northeast corner of the living room, well, one more thing. The item of furniture that is labeled B, and it would be to the west in the living room. Are you able to see that? I know it's sort of
Yes.
small print.
Yep.
That item, to make this really confusing, had once been in the northeast corner of the living room. So you'll have to shift it in the diagram, but it would be how it appears in the photograph with the arrows pointing to it. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Okay. So the time that there were two items in that corner that had DNA and blood on them, what would that tell you? So if a dog alerted there, is a dog alerting to residual odor of a human body or something else in your professional opinion?
It would be my professional opinion that the dog is alerting to the decomposition gases from that biological material that was found in that location.
So if there's been identified a little bit of blood on that coffee table that's in that corner, is there some pooling of the compounds, or is there something there for the dog to sense?
That's correct. So this is not residual odor. This is the dog accurately detecting the presence of that blood sample. Now, the reason that it may not have found that sample is, again, because the gases will have moved, will have pooled, sunk to the ground, been moved by air conditioning, airflow, been captured into that corner, I would think, allowing the dog to have a sufficient concentration there to detect.
Is that what would be called a true positive?
Yes, that's a true positive for a human remains dog.
Your Honor, may I approach? I would like to point at the screen for this next question.
So the jury can see what you're talking about?
Yes, sir.
I think that's fine, unless you have an objection to that, do you?
No, Your Honor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe we should have. Are you going to be there long?
No.
All right. We need to just turn it on where it says mute, I think. Is that what it is?
Dr. Haw, I am pointing at what is marked B. You just talked about it for a moment.
Yes.
It's the item that had once been in the northeast portion of the living room, but is now against the west wall.
Yes.
There's a dog alert to that corner of that couch. Are you able to see that on the diagram?
Yes.
And there was an identification by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation of no blood, but they did find DNA that they associated with Mr. Redwine, Dylan, and Corey Redwine. Are you able to see that? It's the top blue box.
Yes.
Is that, what's your opinion as to what that is? Is that a true positive?
Again, that's a true positive for a cadaver dog. There's a clear biological material there, and the breakdown of that biological material is producing a scent that the dog can detect.
There's another item that's marked C, and on item C, there was blood associated with Dylan Redwine, identified by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Are you oriented to the west side of item C.
Yes.
The fact that there was blood identified by Colorado Bureau of Investigations at that spot and the dog did not alert, what would you call that?
That would be a false negative.
And then there are
That's an
items-
excuse me. That's an error on the part of the dog, a false negative.
And then is it your opinion that these other locations, well, let me start first with the blue, it's kind of a rectangle at the door. Do you see that? It's on the east side.
Yes.
That is the threshold. It was removed. And at any rate, there are dozens of law enforcement, first responders coming over that threshold. Would that have any influence on what you think a dog might sense there?
Yes, we standardly, the process in this is to reject that kind of information because that's a contaminated area. That's a high traffic contaminated area. Unless the crime scene has been extremely well contained and the search is done very, very quickly, that's a common contamination point.
And then at these other locations, so we've talked about a true positive, a false negative. What else is there? And are they present in this living room in your professional opinion?
Well,
That's beyond the scope of his expertise.
Hold on. You're saying it's beyond the scope?
Yes, Your Honor. He's talked a lot about dogs' noses and sensory systems and all that, but to have him go through and talk and characterize these as false positives or false negatives with no training experience is beyond his scope.
Well, I think it's within the scope. I think there's another objection you could raise, but
The fact that it's not in his report at all, I would object to that too.
all right, I understand that. But we've already gotten through this with some other things. I think there's another objection that it doesn't matter. You can go for it, Mr. Moran.
Are there any false positives in that room?
the only other place that I see that I believe the blue dot at the upper part of the house is an indication by the dog, and that would seem to be the question is whether that's a true positive or an error remains open.
Let me switch gears. There was some testimony that it's wise to make sure that a dog is in and out of a location it's sniffing. From an animal behavior standpoint, why is that a good idea to not linger with one of these detector dogs?
Well, because of this idea that they can get frustrated, and so if you're in an area, if you keep a dog in an area and it's not finding anything, then it is not being rewarded. And what will happen is that these dogs want to make their handlers happy. They want to be rewarded. Dogs seek reward, as most of us know. And so if you leave the dog in the area for too long a period of time, it tends to produce a pressure on them to, quote, find something. That is, to do something to get rewarded, and the best way they know to get rewarded is to do a final trained response. And so the longer you leave them in the area, the more likely it would be that they would give a false positive.
Is an hour spent in a house this size, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 to 1,500 square feet, too long from an animal behavior standpoint?
From my knowledge of basic dog cognition, I would say that is a very long period of time.
Would any possible detriment to accurate alerts be increased by the fact that there are two others aside from the handler present in this space for that hour?
Objection that misstates the evidence and creates a false impression for the doctor.
There was one person at the threshold, but the other investigator was in the room. Does that impact?
Objection that
Hold on.
misstates the testimony, Judge. The testimony from the investigator was that they were at the threshold while Ms. Corcoran worked her dog.
It was Investigator Goldbright, Investigator Cowing present inside the room while the work was being done
At the doorway was my
at the
understanding.
threshold. That's acknowledged.
Okay, so did you hear all that, Dr. Ha?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay,
So go
ready?
ahead and answer the question. Answer the
Okay.
question, understanding the investigators were at the doorway. Go ahead.
Okay.
Mike,
It doesn't
that-
matter.
Sorry, go ahead.
It doesn't matter whether the investigators were physically in the room or present at the doorway. The question would be, are the investigators in a position such that the dog was aware that they were present? So whether they're physically, their feet are on this floor plan or their heads are stuck in the door, doesn't matter. What we find in general principles is that that's more people to please, and that increases the pressure on the dog. So it's generally best practices to have the dog either go in alone or go in just with the handler.
Professor, let's leave the house. I'd like to take you now to Middle Mountain. The dog was taken up onto Middle Mountain for 2 days, and it alerted at least 12 times. What would it mean from an animal behavior standpoint if none of those alerts were at locations where remains were actually discovered?
It would mean that you have a large number of false positives, which is not unusual for human remains detection dogs. It would be something that if I was training the trainers, I would be concerned about in a dog. However, most of these trainers, for good reasons, are lenient about allowing false positives because the idea is to find something. And they would rather have the dogs give a final trained response and find nothing than the flip side, which is to have them go past something, miss something. And so they tend to be lenient as long as we don't interpret these false positives as some kind of information. We simply say, oop, the dog got a little overly happy there and tried to get a reward. Let's move on and try and really find something that's important. Then it's not an issue. So many trainers, I think for justifiable reasons, will be lenient, let's say, about these high numbers of false positives. And that's why just simply the fact that the dog does a final trained response, gives a positive response, in my opinion, is not evidence, is not reliable information.
Doctor, you mentioned this in an answer to another question, but there's something called grave soil. What creates that grave soil?
Grave soil is basically the soil that's found under a decomposing mammalian, I suppose other animals too. Any kind of mammal, any kind of animal that's decomposing will decompose into fluids. As the cells break down, the fluid is produced. That fluid can leak down into generally will leak down into the soil and soak the soil. Decomposition continues in that soil. In fact, it actually speeds up in that grave soil, but it produces a certain color. It produces a certain smell. It's detectable by chemical reactions, and of course, since decomposition is continuing to go on in those fluids, it's detectable by a cadaver dog.
When dogs have been trained with human remains that include bones, if bones had been chewed on by carnivores or scavengers and shavings of the bones fall to the ground, is that something a dog might alert to?
Sure, yes, that's again, the bone itself will decompose. It doesn't produce a lot of scent, so it's difficult to detect, but it is certainly detectable.
So where the dog alerts, you would look for that as well, right?
Look for the bone shavings, the remains of bone, and so on, sure.
We're getting there, Doctor, and thank you, everyone, for your patience. There's one last thing that Ms. Corcoran Gumman was brought back to sniff. It was the Dodge truck of Mr. Redwine. You've reviewed materials with respect to that Dodge, is that right?
Yes, I did.
And saw that the Dodge was sniffed 1 year, 2 months, and 25 days after Dylan went missing.
Yes.
Based on your expertise in dog sensory capabilities, would a human remains detection dog be able to reliably identify human remains in the bed of a truck after the passage of that much time?
If there was detectable material left behind, yes.
Does the fact that the truck was stored outside, would that have any impact on it?
That would cause more rapid deterioration, decomposition, and the loss of detectable material.
Say that Dodge pickup truck had human hairs, fingernail clipping inside of it. Would that cause a dog to alert?
It could, yes, that's what they search for.
Would a dog alerting in that car be distinguishing between the smell of death and the smell of a fingernail clipping and hair?
No, it's all decomposition, and they're trained on a variety of different kinds of decomposition, and so any of that is decomposing material.
If the dog that sniffed that Dodge was inserted into the Dodge, if it was picked up and placed into the bed of the truck, would that be a potential cueing situation?
Exactly. That's why it's against best practices to do that. And so, again, it's just a contributing factor to this cueing, this influencing the mindset of the dog and how it responds.
Same thing with picking it up and inserting it into the passenger compartment, same principle.
Yeah, same thing.
And does the fact, would the fact that a dog is 8 years old at the point it's being picked up and lifted into a vehicle, that also influences it?
Well, age can cause a decline and can be very rapid decline in their sensory functioning. And so at that age, it's especially important to have certifications done so that you know that the dog is actually able to still continue detecting.
In your considered expert opinion, can you say with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty whether Ms. Corcoran Gumming's dog was sensing a dead body or something else in Mr. Redwine's house 109 days after Dylan went missing?
I cannot say that. I cannot say that. It's too confounded.
Are you able to say whether it was a dead body or something else on Mr. Redwine's clothing?
No, I cannot. It's all confounded.
And then with respect to the Dodge, it could be the other items from a live human that are causing the dog to alert?
That's correct. I mean, that's the problem with this whole concept of residual odor. It's too intangible. When the dog locates actual biological material, that's a great thing, and they can do it to a degree that we cannot. If they give a positive final chain response and there's nothing detectable there by a good quality investigation, we cannot interpret that information.
Thank you, Doctor. I believe the prosecution will have some questions for you. Thank you, sir.
All right, I think this would probably, you're not going to be 5 minutes, right?
No, Your Honor.
Let's take a recess then. We'll go to, till 25 till 11. So, everybody rise for the jury? Let's take those. That's why I put them here. All right, we'll be in recess.